Okay, we're doing naturalism today. Naturalism, as I mentioned a number of times when we were doing the realists, is pessimistic realism. Remember that the original realistic writers were generally upper middle class. They decided that unlike the Romantics, they weren't going to write about ideals, they weren't going to write about the other world manifesting itself in this world. They were going to write about the real world, and they saw themselves as scientists. Well, when they set up as a standard that the realistic writer ought to describe the world the way it really is, it gradually became apparent to them that their tiny elite social class was not the way humanity was. And so increasingly they went out into the real world, into the world of ordinary people, to describe life. And when they did, most of the time, they came across tragedy. And that's what made them pessimistic, and that's what drove them to the conclusion that basically life is a cruel trap. It's a vicious trap, it's a cruel game, it's fixed, nobody wins. They saw themselves still as scientists, but where the realists were trying to demonstrate specific natural laws about human nature, the naturalist really has only one natural law that they're really intent on putting across, and that is that everybody loses. The universe is indifferent to man. There's no good and evil in the world. All there is these huge natural forces. As you'll see, biology, psychology, economics, geography, culture, all these enormous forces that it would be, even if you studied, even if you could identify one of them, and even if you studied it and got all the degrees there were in it, and worked on it for the whole of your life, you'd still never fully understand the workings of any one of those forces, and there are a number of them. They act on us imperceptibly. They determine everything that's going to happen about us. And what's going to happen about us is that we're going to get ground up by those natural forces, which are absolutely ignorant of our existence, because these forces, unlike fate or destiny or some deity that's running the world, unlike even the generalized idea of good that the Romantics had, these forces aren't personalized. They don't have any intelligence or any awareness. They're just forces. They're sort of like what's called a beat phenomenon. If you put a light behind an object here and it throws a shadow, and you put a light behind another object, where the shadows cross, you have a beat phenomenon. You have something, you have a darker shadow than the other two shadows, which is made up by their interaction. Well, that's basically what most of these forces are. Culture is all of the individuals acting together as a class or a group, even though each one of them may be acting in a completely different way. The general tendency or the general pattern of the group, well, that pattern is constantly changing. It's not strictly definable, and it's not really completely understandable, because by the time you understand it, you'll understand what occurred before, but by then culture has changed. These forces can't be identified, and they are entities, but they're not organisms. So they don't have an intelligence. The universe is not out to get you, but it is going to get you nevertheless. Simply because it doesn't know you exist, and it doesn't care if you exist. When the realists looked around, they saw that most people fight a losing battle against life. And sooner or later it grinds them up. And that's what's going to happen to everybody. So that's their basic scientific fact. Nature is the physical world and the world of objects, and we can understand it, but ultimately the naturalists are, remember at the end of realism we saw how pessimistic the realists were. Things generally don't work out for the best. So their stories don't have happy endings to them. Well, naturalism just has plain awful endings. It always ends up with the worst ending that you could have. So scientifically, their conclusion is that the universe, although not malevolent, is just as destructive as if it would be. It's kind of the bad side of romanticism without any hope for any kind of redemption or salvation. There's no good to counteract this evil, because it's not really a personal evil. It's not even really evil. It's just the process of events, and the process of events come out the same as if they were malevolent, and there isn't anything you can do about it. Like the realists, they believe that the events that they describe are significant not for themselves, but what they reveal about the larger reality, about the laws of human nature. The pattern of the story reveals these scientific principles. The difference is, I think the realists thought that if we understood human nature, we might actually improve it. The naturalists say it doesn't matter. Even if we understand human nature and even if we improved it, these huge forces are still going to act on us, and they're going to grind us up. And there's really nothing much you can do about it. Human actions are part of a larger cause-effect relationship. And if you see number 3, the pessimistic view of human capabilities. There are no heroes as far as the naturalists are concerned. There's also no villains. All there really are is a whole lot of victims as far as naturalism is concerned. People's actions aren't really their actions anyway. We think that we make our own decisions, good or bad, and that our lives are the outcome of decisions that we make. We make our own lives. The naturalist says nothing could be further from the truth. All of our decisions are really pretty much determined, some of them 500 years ago. For example, in the King of the Bingo game, the guy can't get a job. How come?
He doesn't have a birth certificate.
He hasn't got a birth certificate. He hasn't got a birth certificate because of something that happened, something that started happening more than 2,000 years ago. And an economic decision that was made probably 500 years before his birth. How come he hasn't got a birth certificate? Where does he come from?
The South.
The South. Why is that significant?
Because it's poor.
No, poor isn't enough. Although poor enters into it, certainly. He's black and from the South. So why? So in order to get a birth certificate, nobody had been keeping track of births among black citizens once the Civil War ended. Before the Civil War, they did keep track. Why?
They were slaves.
Because they were slaves and they were property and somebody cared about keeping track of their property. But once they weren't, nobody was keeping track. Nobody really cared. So it's really the result of slavery, which comes from an economic change. Once they start opening the New World, they need cheap labor. So you'll see, economics is behind it. Nobody sat down in the 1500s and said, let's make life miserable for everybody who isn't white. They said, where can we get some cheap labor? Slavery. Did slavery start in 1500? No, the whole ancient world runs on slavery. Probably everybody in this room has ancestors that at some point in time were enslaved. That's what the ancient world ran on. That's where it got its labor force. So it had been around a long time. The difference was simply the focus changed. So 500 years before this guy's born, cultural and economic forces created a cascade of events that would eventually deprive him of a birth certificate. Now, wasn't that well, how come, you can understand why the white government in the South wasn't keeping track of whether he was born or not. How come his parents didn't go and register his birth? Where did they probably live, in the city or the country? This is, let's see, this takes place in the 1940s, so he's born probably in the teens or the 20s. Where did most people in America live in the teens and the 20s? In the cities or the country? Live in the country. Pretty far from the county seat. More than likely, his father was a sharecropper. How many days can a sharecropper afford to take off to go and get a birth certificate for one of his children? None. Well, how about his mother? Why didn't she go? First of all, they probably lived 20 miles of dirt road from the county seat, say a 40-mile walking round trip. Is she likely to have children in 1910? Yes, and lots of them. Americans had big families. So what's the likelihood of her being able to take a number of children of varying ages on a 40-mile walking trip to get one of the latest of her children registered? It's not going to happen. And if she got there to the county seat, and if she managed to make it there before it closed, what was the likely response of the white guy in charge of the place? Oh, you'll have to come back tomorrow. Does he want to fill out a series of forms to record the birth of another black person? No. So her trip would have been a failure anyway. So he's doomed not to be able to get this job by something that happened 500 years before he was born. This calamity, this hammer that falls on him, started its downswing 5 centuries before he existed. And there's no way for him to get out from under it. He can't go back and get himself recorded now. He can't change the way the South is in the even in the 40s. So he suffers from this enormous force, a historical force, which was completely impersonal. People didn't sit down in the 1500s and say, how can we make this guy who won't be born for another 20 generations, how can we make his life as miserable as possible? They had no thought of it. It wasn't aimed at him. And he's really no different than all the rest of us. We're all the victim of these large-scale forces, many of which started their movement to roll over us generations ago, if not centuries ago. And there isn't much that we can do about it, because human beings, as far as the naturalists are concerned, are just another kind of animal. The only difference between us and the other animals, as far as the naturalists are concerned, is that we have speech. But other than that, we're the same victims of our basic drives that the animals are. Now, the rationalists have been very proud in saying we have reason, and the realists had emphasized our ability to make small ethical choices. And the naturalists say we don't have any of those abilities. At the bottom, everybody is an animal. They often use the metaphor of the jungle. The law of the jungle. What is the law of the jungle? It's the same as kill or be killed. Kill or be killed. It's what Darwin said, the survival of the fittest. The first rule is, what's in it for me? It's what Hobbes called the war of each against all. We're all in a battle for survival with everybody else on the planet, and our survival usually means that we have to act to the detriment of some, if not all, other human beings. No matter how carefully we try not to do that, when push comes to shove, no matter how noble and liberal you think you are, the naturalists believe that you will turn into an animal and do the worst thing you can think of if that's the only route to your survival. That's why they usually give us primitive characters. In the realistic stories, the characters were sophisticated. They were trying to deal, at least intellectually, with that problem of what do you do in a world that hasn't got any values, for example, with Hemingway. These characters are not sophisticated in any of the stories that we read. They're all basically just driven by the basic natural urges. Fear, sex, hunger, cold, thirst, the necessity for survival. And because they're basically primitive characters, for the most part, their actions tend to be violent. Because that's generally when you corner, it doesn't matter what the animal is, if you corner it and it's faced with life and death, it fights back. It turns to violence. And that's what human beings do. Often the characters are made drunk in the story. Why would the naturalist want to have drunken characters?
Control.
They're out of control. When you get drunk, what happens to your reason? It pretty much leaves you, which leaves you nothing but your animal instincts. So if you want to reduce somebody to the level of the animals, basically getting them drunk is a good way to do it. And that's why the characters so often. Now the characters don't have to be alcoholics. You notice that the guy in the King of the Bingo game isn't necessarily a heavy drinker. Why is it that he only had one drink in that story? Why did it make him drunk?
He's so hungry.
Because he's so hungry he hasn't eaten for 2 days. And the naturalist wouldn't be into the reason that they do that instead of just having him bring his own alcohol in and get himself drunk is because he's not a villain. He's a victim. He didn't decide to fast for 2 days. He hasn't got any money. He hasn't been able to buy any food. And so the liquor goes right into his bloodstream and has that effect on him. But the naturalist doesn't want you sitting there and making moral judgments about the character, even when they behave badly. And to the naturalist, of course they're going to behave badly because they're human beings. Human beings only manage not to behave badly some of the time by an enormous struggle against their natural instincts. It's not like we're naturally good, we're naturally animals. And if we lose the control that keeps our basic animal nature in check, even for a moment, slide over into what we basically are. And of course, you also usually have characters that are under an enormous amount of stress. Because even without alcohol, if you put people under stress, some of them will rise to the occasion. Some of them will act in the best possible manner. But most people won't. And in fact, the naturalist would say even the people who seem to do the right thing are not entitled to any praise for that because they don't really make that decision. It's already been made for them. In other words, those are decisions that they couldn't possibly not make. For example, about 5 years ago, I can't remember his name, but he was a linebacker in the National Football League. He saw 2 kids drowning in a river. He couldn't swim. He jumped in after them. He did manage to push one of them ashore, but he drowned, as did the second child. Now, if the romantics looked at that, what would they tell you about him?
He was a great hero.
He was a great hero. He sacrificed his life for other people. You can't do anything more heroic than that. The naturalist would say he's not a hero at all. He had absolutely no choice in that action, in what he did. It was determined by things that he couldn't even comprehend. First of all, why didn't he just walk away? Well, the romantic would say because people are naturally good and he naturally did the good thing. But this guy's not a guy who could possibly have walked away. He's a player in the National Football League. There's about 1,200 of them. They represent the top 1% of 1% of 1% of all the athletes in the world. It's a tiny, tiny elite group. All his life Has this guy been a hero? More than likely. From the time he started, from the time everybody noticed that he was a head taller than everybody else in his grade. First of all, did he have a choice about becoming a football player? The naturalists would say no. We would say, yeah, he could have been a basketball player or something else. He could have been a scholar. But the odds, no matter how bright he was, the odds on him being a chess champion are pretty slim. You're a head taller and 20 pounds heavier than everybody else in 5th grade. Every football coach in the school district has his eye on you. And by the time you get to 8th grade, they want to know why you're not playing football. And all kind of inducements will be offered to you, and you'll be encouraged. And if you won't take those, you'll be humiliated and harassed until you play. If you got that size and that amount of athletic ability, it gets noticeable pretty early on. And the whole society, would his friends have said, yeah, you ought to be a chess champion? No, they would have said, you could be starting as a freshman. What's the matter with you? They would have all compelled him. So even the choice of his profession, the naturalist would argue, was completely determined. He couldn't walk away from that because he's always been a hero. From the time he was a little kid, he was almost certainly the guy everybody looked up to. If he's somebody who managed to make it to the pros, he must have been way beyond other people's athletic ability right from the beginning. So that means probably every game, every team he played on, he was the go-to guy. He was the guy when the chips were really down that everybody looked to be the hero and save the day. Well, all your life, you've been expected to be the hero. And all your life, you've risen to the occasion. Can you walk away then? No. And notice he plays a combat sport. Generally, you don't play a combat sport unless you buy into that idea of manliness, which says that you have to take action, and generally violent action. You can't sit by, you can't walk away. Probably the worst thing he could think of happening to him would be somebody calling him a coward and being right by his own standards. Well, if he walks away from those drowning children, even though he can't swim, I mean, it's unreasonable to jump into that river. No matter how badly you feel, if you can't swim, you're throwing your life away. Reason would have been on his side. Would he have let himself off the hook for that reason? No. This is a guy who'd been a hero all the time. So he can't walk away. He would be a coward in his own estimation. Now, the naturalist says he didn't think any of that. All of that's a result of social forces and cultural forces acting on him from the time he's a little kid. And those cultural forces, the definition of manliness that he was operating under, didn't start with him. It didn't start when he was born. It started at least as far back as the Middle Ages. This is the knight in shining armor. This is the hero that we read about in the medieval. You can't take a backward step from evil. You can't walk away from being the hero either. So here he's a victim of forces that are 1,000 years old. Well, why didn't he, since he couldn't swim, think about the situation? Why didn't he break a big branch off a tree and stick it out to them for them to grab? Has his success in life come from thinking or acting? From acting. So his instincts are to act, not to think out the situation and see if there are other outcomes than throwing yourself into the river. Biologically, he's predisposed to jump into that river. He's a big, strong guy. He's very athletic. Yeah, he doesn't know how to swim, but it's simply a fight with the water. This guy probably hasn't lost very many fights in his life, if any. So he thinks this is just one more, if he thinks at all. The odds are he doesn't. The fact that he's so big and so muscular, in fact, dooms him to drown. Why?
Muscles heavy.
Muscles heavy. If you notice the swimmers, there's very few swimmers that are really ripped. They've got that muscle with some of the fat mixed in. Fat makes you buoyant. I'm surprised really the Olympic swimmers don't all look like sumo wrestlers. But there's apparently some happy medium between really dense muscle and muscle with some fat in it. But this is a guy with dense muscle. So he's probably not going to, unless he's trained himself to swim, which is unlikely, that's not a sport that ought to attract him. Why?
You don't get to slam anyone.
You don't get this, and that's what he's good at. I mean, that's all. He's got all his equipment for violent action. So he's not going to have as much success with swimming as he will with any of the combat sports. So naturally, he's going to gravitate towards those. And the naturalist says yes. None of those, the very sports that he played, which helped to determine his actions, were not his free choices. They were doomed for him by the society he grew up in and by the biology that he inherited right from the very beginning. He doesn't deserve any credit for being a hero because all he did was conform to the culture that he was born in. He'd been conditioned to jump into that water. He had no chance of avoiding it. He was doomed. He was doomed to drown, the naturalist would argue, the day he was born and maybe even before he's born. One of the things one of the large-scale forces that naturalism sees as acting on people is biology. They don't believe in fate in the sense of some intelligent deity laying out the actions of your life towards a particular end. But there is a fate in the sense that all the decisions you're going to make are you're at least predisposed towards, if not absolutely committed to, before you're ever born. Things happen to you in the womb that decide how you're going to come into this world to begin with. Even before that, your genetic inheritance doesn't start with your parents. Where does it start? With the earliest possible ancestor we can find. You're the sum total of all the choices, all the mating choices that your ancestors made as far back as you've got ancestors. How come I'm not 6'6"? Because all of my ancestors seem to prefer short, stocky people to tall, muscular people. The preponderance of choices were towards my being short. There were a bunch of short people mating for, who knows, 500 generations. Did I get any say in that? Did I ever get to whisper into one of my ancestors' ears, pick the big guy. I want to be tall when I get born. No. All of those choices were made before anybody even conceived of my being here. And so we get a genetic inheritance. We get a genetic inheritance that's basically dumb luck. It's not anything that we chose to do. And it determines our life right from the very beginning. You're 5'3". Are you going to play professional basketball? The odds are way against it. One guy did. Muggsy Bogues, who has a 4-foot vertical leap, which makes him 9'3". So yes, he's the only one. You have a biological inheritance right down to your personality. Your personality is determined by the time you come out of the womb. If you ask anybody, any nurse who works in a pediatric nursery, if the babies are all the same, what will she say? What do you say? No, they're all different. Some cry all the time. Some cry at the slightest noise. Some, you could drop a bowling ball next to their head and they won't wake up. Some don't cry hardly at all. Some cry for a little while, and some cry until they get what they want. So there are personality differences on whether you're going to be a passive person or you're going to be an active person right from the very beginning. And that's determined. It's probably determined partially by what kind of nervous system you get. Now, the nerve impulses travel at about 250 miles an hour, about the rate of a small plane. But within that, there's still a range. Even though the average is about 250, some people's are a foot or two faster, and some are a foot or two slower. Sure, it's hundredths of a second, but hundredths of a second can make a big difference. So maybe you've got a nerve net that responds very quickly to things and to the slightest stimuli. Well, so how are you going to grow up? Are you going to be a relaxed, laid-back kind of person? No. You've been startling right from the beginning. So you can pretty much expect a startled adulthood. And you could guess that. You could go in to a nursery and make a pretty good guess after a relatively brief time of observing the babies which one of them are going to succeed in life, who's going to end up in prison, who's going to commit suicide. And you'd probably be right a surprising amount of the time, just based on the personalities that you see there.
Doesn't the product of your environment have anything to do with this stuff?
Absolutely. That's another of the cultural forces. Biologically, maybe you get really big hands and a lot of fast twitch muscles. There's two kinds of muscles, fast twitch and slow twitch. Fast twitch is good for sprints. Slow twitch is good for endurance. If you get a preponderance of slow twitch muscles, are you going to be a sprinter? No. If you decide to run at all, you're going to be a marathon runner. So if you get the fast twitch muscles, you're going to be a sprinter. You are going to be a sprinter, but you don't have the kind of muscles that have long endurance. So you're not going to be a marathon runner, even if you grew up in a country where marathon running is the thing that everybody aims to do. You get these big hands, you get a lot of fast twitch muscles, you got real good, quick hand-eye, you got good hand-eye coordination, you got quick reflexes. You got all the makings of a concert pianist. And you live in a place where there's not a piano for 500 miles. Are you going to get to be a concert pianist? No. You don't even probably know there is such a thing. You didn't even know what gifts you have. And so you can't set out to develop them. And if the mechanisms for developing those gifts don't exist in your society, no matter how great your gifts are, the odds are they're never going to get developed. So your environment definitely comes into play. But again, it's not a matter of choices. It's a matter of at least two in that instance, very large-scale forces, biology and culture, or biology and geographic location. You get born in Alaska. I don't think there are a lot of music teachers in Alaska. I don't think there are a lot of music scholarships in Alaska. So that means the odds go way down. As you see, one of the other things that, one of the other forces that they like to think about a lot, or to mention a lot, is economics. Money talks. It's Marxism. Marx says money talks, and what it says is civilization. Money determines everything that we do. The events of your life are determined largely by the economic circumstances that you're born into. Occasionally, now America is not a classless society. We like to lie and say that we are, but we're far from that. Everybody can tell you pretty much where they stand in the social hierarchy of the country. The odds on you going from the very bottom of the lowest class to the very top of the highest class in your lifetime by your own efforts are pretty approaching zero. Generally, people climb about a half a rung up this very long ladder, or a rung and a half at the most from what their parents were. So what that means is that you're born into a set of economic circumstances which you are probably not going to transcend. Yes, a few people manage to do that, but the naturalist says, well, it's all random. Of course, Some few might manage to survive that way. They might become materially successful despite having enormous economic handicaps in the beginning, but it doesn't matter because they're going to get ground up anyway. They're going to get ground up because, you have to take a guess on this one, I would assume. Big money. Is it easy to handle? No, it takes a lifetime of getting used to. One of the reasons why the rich stay the rich is because they're used to handling the money. We don't have I imagine if you're in this classroom, you probably don't have the experience of having millions of dollars to just throw away at your leisure. If you had, you'd probably be in Harvard. Smart hasn't got anything to do with being in Harvard or Yale. Money has to do with it. I mean, you don't think George Bush graduated from Yale. So that pretty much means if you could pass the dog training classes and have the money, you could get in there too. So I imagine that you don't have it. Well, if you're not used to having money all the time and having resources all the time, when you finally get them, how good are you going to be at handling them? Probably not very good. The minor temptations of your life, I mean, we're all generally conditioned to pursue riches. The naturalist would argue that if you manage to achieve them, all you are is a step in the doom of your children. Now, why would they think that? You make a lot of money. That means your kids are going to grow up with a lot of money. What does that do for their opportunities? More or less. Mr. Pecci?
Oh, you can do a lot of things.
They can do a lot of things that you couldn't do when you were young, which seems to be a good thing. They're going to be exposed to a lot more things than you are. Are they going to be exposed only to good things? No. If you ever go and look at the prep schools, for the most part, prep schools are the reformatories of the rich. And they are never short of students. Because when you have money, your opportunities to screw up your life go up geometrically. So what looks like a wonderful thing, you achieve material success, the naturalist would say, is just one more step in a tragedy, although the naturalist probably wouldn't say there is any such thing as tragedy, because tragedy implies that it's something that's unusually bad, and to the naturalist, all life leads to tragedy. Everybody is going to get ground up by these enormous forces. So they'd say, happy as you are about your material success, it's really only a step in the destruction of your children, or their children. That you're part of a process that ultimately is going to grind up some human being. And what look like our successes, just the way what looks like heroism and what looks like villainy really isn't. It's just one kind of victimhood or another. It's the same with your successes. There are no successes to the naturalist. You temporarily stave off disaster. Can you keep disaster at bay forever? Not according to the naturalist. Sooner or later, no matter how much you have, no matter how smart you are, you're going to get ground up. There are forces that have been in effect for more time than we can reckon, whose momentum leads them towards the end of grinding up your personal life.
Doesn't mean just roll over and die, you know?
That was the big problem of the rationalists, because that's a good point. That's exactly what the conclusion some of them came to. It might be why Jack London, who wrote To Build a Fire, after having had enormous success, I mean, he started out really doesn't know where your next meal is coming from, spending a couple years in his teens on the road as a bum, poor, to being phenomenally wealthy, and he committed suicide. When you look around and see these forces that are grinding up everybody, and you realize, well, sooner or later they're going to grind you up, why stay alive? Why not cut your throat now? Save yourself the trouble. That's probably why naturalism eventually, by the 40s, or even a little bit earlier than that, gives way to existentialism. Existentialism says the same thing. There's no God, there's just these big natural forces. They're grinding us up. Your life is meaningless. Everybody dies. Death is the end of everything. But you give your life meaning by deciding to live it and not cutting your throat. Sounds like a pretty messed up philosophy that says the most the most noble act you can commit is not cutting your throat in the morning. It's no wonder it went out of popularity once recreational drugs came in the 60s, and tranquilizers.
It's basically a form of suicide anyway.
Yes, it is, just longer and slower. Which the naturalist would say, of course it is. Everything in the long run to the naturalist is a form of suicide. You're going to get ground up in the end. It's a good thing it's a nice sunny day out, because if I were telling you this stuff on a foggy, cloudy day, I could pass out razor blades at the end of the class, and half of you might use them. I'm surprised that the naturalists ever even bothered to write anything. I mean, once they came to, of course, I guess it's because they didn't come to that conclusion all at once. They kept looking around, trying to find somebody who escaped the big grinding wheels of the world. And after a long period of time, they went, nobody gets out. Everybody gets crushed. And then some of them committed suicide. And others, I guess, were just too afraid to do that. It took them a while to absolutely convince themselves that nobody was going to win this game. That everybody ends up being a victim sooner or later. And when they reached that, a lot of them were alcoholics, like all writers, alcoholics and drug addicts and all kind of bizarre social behavior. Almost as a way, I guess, of saying, well, I may get ground up and I'm going to grab what I can right now before I do. Which is, again, one of the approaches to existentialism. It's called hedonistic existentialism. Everybody's going to die. Party till you drop. Better to burn out than rust. That's really that approach that the Hemingway's realists took, that the Lost Generation takes. The naturalism doesn't even have that. And they try to, again, they see themselves as scientists, so they think they're coming to a logical, reasonable conclusion about how everything is going to come out. The principles of scientific determinism, which is basically everything is the result of other forces, sometimes measurable, often not. Everything that looks like free will really isn't. Human beings are the victims. And again, everybody's a victim. Even the villains are victims. If they had only let Adolf Hitler into art school, instead of ridiculing his paintings, the Holocaust might not have happened. Little thing like that. All of the monsters of history, if you look at them, generally didn't get there because they were personally evil. Although, if you were romantic, you could define them that way. They got there because they were victims, according to the naturalists, of one force or another. Most of the serial killers don't have happy childhoods. Most of the child abusers were themselves abused. The people who addict themselves to drugs often are not generally the first generation in their family to do that, to fall prey to drugs. So the naturalist says we're all victims. They're no bad guys. They're no good guys. They're just people in the grip of these enormous forces that they can't possibly comprehend. And some of those forces are economic. Some of them are social. That jungle, that law of the jungle still exists. It's still survival of the fittest. It's called social Darwinism. You take Darwin who says survival of the fittest. And then you take the rich who say we're the rich because we're the fittest. Are we the nicest? No. Are we the kindest? No. Are we the physically strongest? No. But we're the fittest to survive. If we weren't, we wouldn't have so much stuff to survive with. So it's not that we're we're evil by exploiting everybody else for our personal benefit. We're just following nature. The naturalist would argue that if you were rich, no matter how far left you are, if you get rich, you'll move to the right overnight. And probably no matter how rich you were, and no matter how far to the right you were, if you end up having to struggle for survival every day, you're going to move to the left overnight. Not because of you, but because of economic forces. Economy determines, the Marxists argue, economy, money determines everything.
Not always. Not always. Some people take the straight route.
How? Give me an example of one. I'm not saying you're wrong. I can't think of an example offhand, but that
if you look at like what's his name? Not George Soros. The other guy who does. I can't think of the name, but he's always remained the same. I mean, he came from not a lot of money. Now he's one of the top investors. I don't know what his name is, but he's always stayed the same. Meaning, like, he never went to the left side or the right side. I don't know. Does everyone know what they mean by the left and right side here? Some people not.
Politically left and politically right, conservative and liberal.
Warren Buffett.
He started out in the middle and didn't go either way.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah, Marx would argue that the very fact that he didn't, and again, whatever philosophy you have, you always twist things to fit it. Marx would say the fact that he didn't take the wealth that he had and use it entirely for other people meant that actually he just became worse a conservative than he was. And he was probably more generous. That it's more generous to give a quarter out of your last dollar than it is to give $1 million out of your last billion. So they would have argued that although he seems not to have changed, in fact, because his circumstances changed, but he stayed the same, he really did move more to the right. The fact that he's an investor, Marx would have said, well, right there you have the economic determination. That he didn't go into something else.
He's not once ever changed his philosophy, though.
His political philosophy.
Yeah, exactly.
Marx would have said, even if you could convince the Marxists that that was true, and you would have a hard time because they're like talking to anybody else who's committed to an idea. They would say his life was still determined by economy. I mean, the very fact that that you can make a living investing other people's money is a result of economics. That unless this guy really loves investing, and that's what he does, and he would do it even if you didn't pay him, the Marxists would argue that his life is determined by money. And they would argue true for just about everybody.
What I'm saying also is, he could have followed the technology, whatever, the technology fields, but he stayed and remained the same. And look what happened to all those other followers that went on to the other side. Now in this recession, almost you can consider it called a recession.
He didn't get destroyed by the naturalists would have trouble with that too. He didn't get destroyed.
Yeah.
But he isn't dead yet either. Remember what Sophocles says, count no man lucky who is not dead. I mean, we may still come to an economic disaster that sweeps him away as well. Maybe not, but the naturalists would say, it doesn't matter. He'll get swept away one way or another. The naturalists just don't believe anybody dies happy. Even if your economic life is satisfactory, your work life is satisfactory, some other part of your life is probably miserably painful. But then again, they're pessimistic. They think this is the natural law, and wherever you see that natural law seeming to be violated, you just haven't watched long enough. The squirrel that's sitting in the middle of the highway with acorns all around it looks like it's in a real great position. But if you wait there and watch long enough, it's going to be tire marks on the pavement sooner or later. And that's almost a naturalistic story in itself. I mean, in a romantic story, somebody might get run over by a truck pushing a child out of the way. That would be a romantic story. In a naturalistic story, the truck runs them over and then backs up trying to run. Runs over their body and doesn't quite kill them, thinks they're parked on top of them, and backs up and runs over their head by accident. Then you know you've got a naturalistic story. And again, the person who did that wouldn't get any kind of credit for what got them into those circumstances anyway. This would all be the result of their society. Psychologically, we're determined. Freud has a lot of effect. Remember, this naturalism's coming in at the beginning of the 20th century, early in the teens, in the 20s. And so is Freudian psychology. And you know, Freud says there's three parts of the personality: the ego, the superego, and the id. The id is the animal, basic animal drives, the I want. The superego is the rules generally imposed by society. You can't have it because. And the ego is the part of the personality that tries to mediate between these two completely diametrically opposed forces in the mind to try to get you through the real world. Generally by offering fantasies or symbols to the id, which can't tell reality from fantasy for very long. But what that says is that most of our behavior is unconscious. That everybody's got a monster living inside of them, which is always trying to get out. And nobody manages to keep it locked up every minute of every day of their lives. Sooner or later, the id gets loose. We can see where that leads to, why that leads to pessimism. Everybody is a potential homicidal maniac. The only reason that madman in your mind doesn't get out and do the damage he wants to do is because your superego keeps an almost eternal vigilance on him. But the fact that he hasn't slipped his chains in 20 years or 30 years or 50 years doesn't mean he isn't going to. So it's pretty pessimistic to say at the bottom, we're all a bunch of dangerous madmen held under control by a thread. And that thread can break at any time. And you can't think your way out of it. Freudian psychology says most of your motivations aren't accessible to your intellect. You don't even know why you like the things you like or why you want the things you want. And nobody can help you know either. You really can't figure it out what the id's going to want next. Like the realists, they try to get a documentary presentation of the material. They just try to show you somebody in circumstances which are going to destroy them by the end of the story. And they always do. They want that slice of life, like the realists do. They're not trying to give you the whole. They know that you got ground up by some social forces that started out a year after the Crusades. They're not going to trace it all the way from them. All they want is the moment of crisis when you get destroyed, when those forces finally impact on you and grind you up. They select representative types, but the representative types are usually primitive versions of whatever type they're looking at. Even if you look at Mademoiselle in the necklace, who doesn't sound very primitive or very violent. She comes out of a class. Well, what class is she born into? Mademoiselle, the necklace? She's born into a family of clerks. French 19th century bourgeoisie. The middle class. So she's not, you don't notice her as being as much of an animal, but she's driven by vanity. She's vain. So she's not the most highly developed and sophisticated type even within her social class. So when they look for representative types, and they generally look for rudimentary representative types. Again, human beings are not condemned or applauded for their actions because they don't have any choice about them. They make the choices that they make purely as a result of forces that they have no control over, which they don't even know are acting on them. Occasionally, the naturalists will do two things. One, they'll bring nature into the story often. As in, well, which of those three stories uses nature the most? To build a fire, king of the bingo game, or the necklace?
Build a fire.
To build a fire. The struggle is against nature. And nature there is personified not as it is for the Romantics, an expression of good in the world. It's personified as this enormous, faceless, and indifferent force. Does nature set out to kill that guy and freeze him to death?
No.
No. Doesn't even know he's there. The Yukon, it's 70 degrees below zero, not so that it could freeze this person to death, but because of patterns in the upper atmosphere, the upwelling of water off the coast of California, the retreat of the glaciers during the Ice Age is what causes that weather, not because it's set out to freeze this guy to death. So when we see nature, it's not the nature of the Romantics. It's not an expression of goodness in the world. It's the expression of force. Blind, ignorant, but enormously powerful force. Force that we really can't even completely comprehend. We're getting to understand the weather a little bit, but there's still enormous parts of it we can't possibly understand, and that's only a teeny part of nature. So we'll never really understand nature. And the other thing that they'll sometimes use in the story is that idea of fate. But again, it's not a personal fate. It's not that you individually were given a set of circumstances to live in. It's, in fact, the expression of what the naturalists felt about that, you can see best in that poem, Hat, where he talks about everything being run basically by chance. And it's all dumb luck. The writer, the speaker in the poem, obviously has a lot of stuff in his life which hasn't made him very happy. He's had a lot of bad luck. And he says, I could live with that. If but some vengeful God would call to me from up the sky and laugh, thou suffering thing, know that thy sorrow is my ecstasy, that thy love's loss is my hate's profiting. And I would bear it, clench myself and die. If I only knew there was a personal God out to get me, I wouldn't care why. I could kill myself then, just for spite, and not be unhappy about it. I'd be lifted by the sense, though, that my suffering made some sense. I didn't deserve it. It wasn't fair, but at least it made some sense. Half eased, and that a powerfuler than I had willed and meted me out the tears I shed. If God was out to get me, I could live with that. But not so. How arrives that joy lies slain? And why unblooms the best hope ever sown? Why is it, and this will happen to you over and over in your life, where you'll be on the brink of what you think is the breakthrough, and most of those will collapse before the deal will never get made, the opportunity will turn out not to be an opportunity after all, you'll miss it in some way. And he says, why is that? Why do these things always turn out bad? Crass casualty. Pure, blind, dumb luck obstructs the sun and rain, and dicing time. What's dicing mean? It's not slicing things up in smaller pieces. It's playing at dice. Time gambles with us. And it's just the roll of time's dice that gives you gladness or a moan. These purblind doomsters that as readily strewn glisses above my pilgrimage's pain. These half-blind determiners of life could have just as easily have thrown good things in my way as bad. It's all dumb luck. It's all chance. Nobody's directing it. That's probably why they're the pessimistic naturalists, why they're so upset by the way things come out. There's a fate, but the fate is the intersection of forces. And if you'd just been born somebody else or somewhere else or somewhen else, you'd have gotten ground up in a different way, but you wouldn't be suffering whatever it is now. That what happens to you doesn't happen to you because you're a good person. Doesn't happen to you because you're a bad person. It just happens. Pure blind chance. Let's take a break until 3 o'clock, and we're going to look at the stories in the poems and how they reflect naturalism.